You wake up, but not in your bed. No pillow, no fan humming, no notification telling you good morning. Instead, you hear wood creaking. Beneath you is something soft, but not memory foam. Soft like hay, pointy like betrayal, damp like secrets, and certainly not sanitized. You open your eyes. The ceiling is made of crude wood, cracked like your finances last year. One wall is moldy. The window is the size of a regret. And the smell, it's human, possibly yours, possibly someone else's, possibly livestock. Where are you? Welcome to the Middle Ages, not the romantic kind with violins and heroic knights. No background score, no slow-motion horse entrance. Just reality, cold, dirty, and completely lacking an exit button. You try to stand and trip over a leg. Not yours. You're not alone. It might be a relative. It might be a servant. It might be a pig. In the Middle Ages, shared bed wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was your fate. And you clearly are not the main character in this dream. You look for a light switch. Nope. You look for a bathroom. Definitely not. You look for Wi-Fi. Sorry, Wi-Fi won't be invented for another few centuries. The only thing connecting people here is the smell. You breathe deeply, not to meditate, but to identify. Where is that coming from? Outside, a rooster crows. Not to wake you, but to scream to the world. I survived, you will see. You think about coffee, there isn't any. Your breakfast will be air, coughing, and maybe a dry biscuit if the rats left you some. No oat milk, no poached eggs. No what I eat in a day videos. Just bread that doubles as a weapon and soup that forgot it was soup. And you still don't know why you're here. No tutorial, no pop-up screen saying you are now in the 14th century. Just one very clear feeling. If you're going to survive, you'll need to adapt to a world where hygiene is optional, privacy is fictional, and livestock is basically a roommate. You are in the Middle Ages, not for the experience, but to live quietly, like the people who came before you and were never remembered by name. You think, all right, I've woken up. First thing, take a shower. Well, bad news. You've time traveled to an era where bathing is a luxury, often reserved for religious holidays or people rich enough to own more than one spoon. Here, if you bathe more than twice a year, people look at you like you're hiding something, probably heresy. The average person doesn't have a tub, or a bucket, or a concept of steam. They have ash from the fireplace and maybe a few herbs. Not for fragrance, mind you, but to cover up what you really are. Soap, wonderful, just trade a goat for it. It's made from animal fat and lye, strong enough to scrub sin and skin in equal measure. If you're wondering what people do when they get dirty, here's the answer. They adapt. Body odor isn't a problem, it's a personality. It's the national anthem of shared spaces. Everyone has it. No one complains. Hair isn't washed. Clothes aren't laundered. Beds aren't changed. Everything stays the same, like a historical record of sweat. Even outfits, they often had just one. You wore it, slept in it, lived in it. And if that tunic could talk, it would beg to be reincarnated. And now for your favorite part, lice. The most reliable companions of the medieval citizen. Lice don't discriminate. They love royalty and peasants equally. You sleep, they feast. You scratch, they move. It's a relationship built on commitment. You look around, no mattress, no blanket, no fresh linen, no fabric softener, no morning breeze scent, just the smell of who you are and who's been here before you. Toilets erase the thought. In cities, maybe a shared bucket. In the countryside, a hole. Outdoors in the wind with possibly an audience. No toilet paper, there's straw, leaves, or your hand. Don't ask what comes first. Just know that hand washing is a suggestion, not a habit. Toothbrushing. Yes, it exists, sort of. With what? Ash, charcoal, sometimes ground up bricks. You don't know if your teeth are cleaner, but you feel spiritually exfoliated. You wonder, how did people stand this? Truth is, they didn't notice. When you're born into the smell, it doesn't feel like suffering. It feels like Tuesday. Like how you accept weak Wi-Fi until you experience fiber optic. And if you're still listening, congratulations. You've made it through medieval hygiene without scratching your scalp raw. Up next, what's for dinner when everything's either fermented, dried, or slightly alive? Let's find out. You're hungry, and as a modern human, your first reflex is, what's there to eat? No apps, no menus, no spicy chicken wrap ordered with a thumb swipe. Just a wooden table so uneven it feels like it was assembled during an earthquake. On it is your breakfast, or lunch, or dinner, it's hard to tell. The menu doesn't change. It only depends on seasons and how recently a rat got into the pantry. Water? Don't. It's suspicious. Looks clear, sure. But inside, it's a universe of invisible things waiting to meet your digestive system for the last time. So people drink weak beer, even children, partly for safety, partly because being sleepy keeps the questions away. What does it taste like? Imagine lukewarm barley tea mixed with the sound of someone burping nearby. Bread is the main dish, but not soft, fluffy bread. This is black bread, dense, heavy, structurally sound enough to build a fence. You can eat it, or defend yourself with it, or build a bench. Meat, rare, usually salted like emotional trauma. Vegetables, if you grow them, if you survive the harvest season. Fresh fruit, depends. Are you royalty? Spices. Oh, my dear child, spices are edible gold. A pinch of pepper equals 1 cow. A bit of cinnamon equals a dowry. So people eat bland, not because they're health conscious, because seasoning equals bankruptcy. Utensils, no forks, no knives, no plates for one, just hands. And maybe someone else's hand because you're sharing. The concept of personal space dies at the dinner table. Want to eat in peace? Too bad. Mid-meal interruptions include swatting flies, dodging rats, and explaining why you're not sharing your last crust of bread with your cousin's wife's priest's apprentice. Vegetarian. Not a choice, just the result of there is no meat. No one calls it detox. They call it what's left. Mealtime is quiet, not out of reverence, out of necessity. Everyone's too busy chewing things dry enough to double as building material, or mentally calculating how many bites they have left before someone else notices. You miss apples, cheese, tea. Instead, you have slightly stale bread, weak beer, and the lingering thought, maybe I should have trained as an assassin. At least they eat alone. If you're still here, congrats. You've made it through your first medieval meal without starting a peasant uprising. Next up, what work looks like when society doesn't believe in weekends or dreams. You think, okay, I should probably get to work. And you're right. Not because you need money, but because in the Middle Ages, work isn't a choice. It's your destiny. You're born into a class, and you die in it. There's no inspiring success story, no rising above, just surviving one winter at a time. If you're a peasant, your life is tied to the land, not metaphorically, literally. You plant in it, sleep near it, eventually return to it. Your day starts at dawn, not because you love mornings, but because if you wait too long, the sun will kill you with heat fatigue. And you work until it's too dark to see the plow or the blade, whichever comes first. No weekends, no paid leave, no deadlines because you are the deadline. Dead means done. Children, they work too. As soon as they can carry anything heavier than a grudge, they learn while working. If they're lucky, they also learn to read. If not, they memorize the sound of disappointment and wooden spoons. You ask, so who's rich? The nobles, always they own land. The same land you bleed into, and they tax you. For the privilege of that bleeding, you don't ask why. You just bow and say thank you for the opportunity to be exhausted. Society is a ladder, and each rung is someone else stepping on your back. Want to escape? There's one door, the monastery. Yes, going monastic, not for enlightenment, but because monasteries have roofs, books, and warm bread. But not everyone gets in. You must know how to read, how to write, how to hear a bell and not flinch, and most importantly, how to stay quiet. The monastery doesn't welcome talkers. In this world, your social status is printed on your soul from birth. You don't work to succeed. You work not to die, or not to be accused of witchcraft. You think another job might be better. Maybe. Try blacksmith, risk blindness, hunter, risk limb loss, street performer, risk being misunderstood as possessed. Every profession is a lottery, and no one asked to buy the ticket. Upward mobility, up from where? From starving to less starving. From commoner to someone whose name was almost remembered once. You get the idea. If you're still listening, congratulations. You haven't been conscripted yet, but don't get too comfortable, because next up, when belief becomes surveillance, let's talk religion. You hear church bells, not the charming kind from holiday movies, but the kind that clangs just enough to remind you that today is for penance, like yesterday and tomorrow, and every day until you meet your designated saint or your final judgment. In the Middle Ages, religion isn't just a belief system. It's the default operating system, from birth to death and beyond. God is always present, watching, judging, and rarely offering tech support. Want to get married? Church approval required. Want to get healed? Pray first. Want to plant onions? Check the holy calendar. In case it's a saint's day you've never heard of. Superstition isn't casual. It's the second most trusted news source after the church. See a black cat? Sin. Lunar eclipse. Open auditions for demons. Fever. Possession. Bad harvest. Someone probably used the outhouse in the wrong direction. Medicine depends. You might get holy water, or have your veins sliced open to release bad humors. If you live, miracle. If you die, spiritual maturity. And if you help people heal with herbs, congratulations. You're now a potential witch. midwives, herbalists, sleep talkers, anyone who improves quality of life without clerical approval is suspicious. You think you're innocent, lovely, but innocent isn't evidence. It's just the state you're in until someone needs a bonfire. Religion oversees your sexuality, your marriage, your outfit length, your public posture, and possibly your dreams. Dream the wrong thing, that's a warning sign. Not because you meant harm, but because no one can confirm otherwise. Ask, were people happy? Answer, no one asked. Happiness is a luxury. More important is getting absolved before getting noticed. And in this world, silence is survival. Not because you have nothing to say, but because any question could be misunderstood as heresy. And God is always watching. No one sees God, but everyone's scared to be seen by Him. If you're still listening, you haven't been accused of thinking yet. Congratulations. But next, we enter a realm where justice is swift, loud, and often heavily armed. Let's talk law. You feel a little uneasy, not because you've done something wrong, but because in the Middle Ages that doesn't matter. You don't need to be guilty. You just need to be nearby, at the wrong time, or around the wrong person. Law here isn't written for clarity. It's passed around by word of mouth, edited by memory, mood, and maybe the weather. There are no police, just your local lord's guards. Often drunk, occasionally violent, always armed. Sometimes the crowd handles it, and you'd be surprised how quickly a rumor can turn a cabbage vendor into a suspected heretic. Punishments, inventive and immediate: stealing, chop a hand, insult a noble, caged in iron and left to reconsider your tone, blasphemy, public hanging, or fire, whichever's more theatrical that day. Witch trials, don't worry. They're fair, you get dunked in water. If you float, you're guilty. If you sink, you're innocent and dead. There are no lawyers, no right to remain silent, no wait for your attorney. You can scream, but that mostly just adds ambience. Your testimony, useless, unless you're a noble or brought wine. Accusations, on the other hand, powerful. You can accuse someone of heresy, and if your friends nod hard enough, that person disappears before sunset. Investigation. Welcome to torture. Deny the crime, more torture. Admit the crime. Still torture because now you clearly know too much. If you're a child, depends. You might be pitied or used as proof of evil. Kids who cry too much, possessed. Kids who don't cry enough, definitely possessed. You ask, was there fair trial for anyone? Sure, God gets one, after you're dead. Until then, your fate lies with whoever has the loudest voice and the heaviest stick. Even walking past a trial is risky. Cough wrong, suspicious. Breathe funny. Could be sorcery. Justice isn't blind. It just looks the other way if you're poor, if you're still here. You haven't been arrested for listening too carefully. Well done. Next, we explore the Medieval Information Network, otherwise known as whatever Dave from the tavern said. You want to know what's going on? Good luck. In the Middle Ages, no one really knows anything. And that's part of the charm. There's no internet, no newspapers, no radio, no TV, no TikTok, no podcasts. Just Steve from next door, who starts every story with, "I heard from someone who knows someone." Official news source. The church, unofficial source. The butcher, the gatekeeper, the drunk by the fire. Basically anyone with vocal cords and free time. Every piece of information has passed through at least 3 layers of exaggeration and 2 of emotional seasoning by the time it reaches you. It's a tale about a chicken that cursed a bishop and ran off with a barmaid. You ask, is it true? People blink like you've asked whether clouds feel sadness. Education depends. If you're the child of a peasant, you learn by ear, by hand, or by wooden spoon. If you're noble, you get a tutor. If you're weirdly lucky, you get into a monastery. Schools are rare, mostly in big cities or tucked inside monastic walls. Teachers are clergy, the curriculum, the Bible, and then more Bible. Subjects include reading scripture, copying scripture, memorizing scripture, not asking why it's always scripture. There are no textbooks, no PowerPoint, no worksheets, just ink, parchment, and a stick to the wrist if you smudge your lines. Books aren't printed, they're copied by hand. A single book can take years. Spill ink on it, you just destroyed someone's lifetime. Kids don't learn to chase their dreams. They learn not to be called stupid in front of the priest, and even if you can read. So what? If you're not in a monastery, people wonder, who let you? Most folks rely on storytelling, passed from one mouth to another, from market to inn, from forge to fire pit, until rumor becomes belief, and belief becomes a very awkward execution. You still hear, good. You've now outlearned the average peasant, but don't rest yet. We're not done. It's time to talk about how people had fun when everything around them was either damp, dangerous, or deeply cursed. You ask, if everything's dirty, hard, and dangerous, how did people in the Middle Ages have fun? Answer, by doing anything that didn't kill them immediately. No electricity, no TV, no screens, which means no mindless scrolling while pretending to be productive. Entertainment, other people, and sometimes you. When you accidentally become the day's public execution. On good days, the village throws a fair, a religious one. Sounds holy, mostly an excuse to eat, drink, play games, and pretend not to see the priest sipping something stronger than sermon juice. There's puppet theater, storytelling, juggling, sometimes on purpose, sometimes just someone tripping. Folk games like ring toss onto goat horns, mud hopping without boots, playing dead so convincingly the neighbors start planning your funeral. No holiday, you gather around a fire, not for warmth, but to confirm you're still alive. The elders tell stories, the young ones listen, not out of respect, but because there's nothing else to do. Winter slows everything down. No one ventures far. Entertainment becomes a sport called. Guess which villager won't make it to spring? There is music if you have an instrument, and if that instrument doesn't sound like Satan's doorbell. If you're a woman, more complicated. Too much laughter equals suspicious. Too quiet equals suspicious. The goal is to be just entertaining enough not to be burned. Sometimes fun is just sitting alone, with no screaming, no rumors, no coughing in the background, a rare silence that feels like joy. Just for a moment, you feel maybe. Life is worth retelling, still here. You've survived medieval entertainment, and now, you deserve a moment of peace. But first, A gentle reminder you're not really there. You're in a bed, in a room, with electricity, hot water, and Wi-Fi, so breathe, smile, and yes, you made it to the end, almost. One final part to go. You survived the toilets with no water, the bread as hard as church stone, and a justice system where sneezing too loud might get you stoned. Congrats! You're officially qualified to enter another brutal chapter of the Middle Ages. The era where people didn't try to improve reality, they simply blurred it. Because sometimes when you can't clean up the world around you, the only logical move is to smudge it. Blur your vision, blur your thoughts, blur any memory of yesterday. And so the drinking begins. Leaves get crushed, breathing gets warmer or weirder. This is the world of unlabeled intoxicants, a place where getting drunk wasn't a sin, it was a survival tactic. Medieval folks got buzzed, too. They just didn't have ingredient lists, hotlines, or little warning labels about operating carts while under the influence. They tried everything modern chemistry would label deeply questionable. Some steeped roots in wine, others inhaled smoked herbs. Many just drank whatever was fermenting in the corner and prayed it didn't kill them before it kicked in. Intoxication wasn't pleasure, it was anesthesia. It was a fire escape from life's burning building. It was how they told the world, I know I control nothing, but at least I can make myself dizzy. There were no instructions, no dosage guidelines. Every trip was a negotiation with fate. No one said, I'm regulating my nervous system. They said, I need to forget for a while. And honestly, who could blame them? In a world where clean water was a myth, law was a dice roll, and the future wasn't part of anyone's schedule. Drunkenness was a brief act of emotional CPR. Some nights they'd sit by a fire, pouring what once was grape and now resembled a bad decision, and drink. Not for fun, but to go silent. Not to escape, but to breathe deeper. No one needed a good reason to step out of consciousness. Just a full cup and a room that didn't ask too many questions. What were they chasing? Maybe God, maybe themselves, maybe just a single night without clarity. And if that came in a cloudy bottle or a bag of leaves that smelled like expired sage, so be it. The Middle Ages weren't short on intoxicants, just on anyone who knew when to stop. If you had to choose one substance that was legal, available, and could help you forget that your village had zero plumbing, it was alcohol. No codes, no prescriptions, no RSVP required. Booze was everywhere. At the inn, on the dinner table, in church, and occasionally in the hands of a 4-year-old. Yes, kids drank too. Not because their parents were negligent, but because clean water was as rare as a Lord who listened. In a world where every sip of water could come with a symphony of bacteria, a mug of watered-down ale was safe and rich in vitamins of resignation. Alcohol wasn't just for drinking, it was for surviving. Laborers drank to forget the pain in their backs. Pilgrims drank to keep walking on swollen feet. Monks drank to understand the word of God, or to forget they had to transcribe it for 40 years by candlelight. Everyone had a reason, and everyone had the right to blur. Some festivals lasted days, where the whole village got drunk, sang, and collapsed into hay like it was sacred ritual. Drunkenness wasn't punished. It was seen with empathy. Oh, he's communing with the ancestors. But break a cup at the tavern. Prepare for divine wrath. Religious exemption not included. Urban-fused wine, thick beers, mead, all had their purpose. To treat colds, to survive winter, to help you sleep when your bed had no mattress and rats hosted nightly dance parties. Some drank to go quiet, some to speak truths they'd never dare say sober. Others drank because everyone else was drinking, and in that world, not drinking was the real red flag. Alcohol was a collective shelter. It didn't fix things, it softened the view. Every sip was a way of telling life. I know this is a joke, but at least I'm laughing softly. And while wine slid down their throats, they forgot the broken road, the offbeat church bell, and the neighbor's suspicious glare. They didn't become wiser, just better at enduring. And sometimes that was enough to make it to tomorrow. Not everyone had access to booze, and not everyone wanted the kind of intoxication that came with community approval. Some didn't want to blur reality. They wanted to explode it. Enter herbs. But don't imagine chamomile tea under morning sun. No. These were plants with names like curses, smells like secrets, and side effects like cautionary tales. Some brewed mandrake root, the one said to scream if plucked wrong. Others used henbane, which could cause vivid visions or 3-day naps. Belladonna, the beautiful woman, might just blind you or help you chat with your shadow. No one knew the dose. No one taught you how to use it. The only guides were survivors or rumors from those who weren't. Herbalists could be monks, midwives, or the weird lady outside town who brewed tea and stared too long. No labels, no instructions. Just rub this on your chest, or worse, places you really don't want to rub unless your doctor's name is on the door. And no, drinking it was too tame. Absorption through delicate membranes was all the rage. Some brews treated headaches. Others unlocked conversations with angels. The difference? A coin toss. Some woke up 3 days later shouting, "I've been saved." Others didn't wake up at all. No one sued. There were no courtrooms for bad trips, only shallow graves and lessons written in regret. There were no, not for pregnant women, warnings. No after-hours helpline. No may cause drowsiness disclaimer. But some concoctions made you forget what sleep was, because you were busy negotiating with the moon. And while the world outside kept spinning on wheels of wood and public executions, inside a smoky cottage someone was inhaling fumes, heart slowing, eyes glazing over, not for fun, but for survival. In a place where consciousness was punishment, unconsciousness became a strangely rational response. Nothing complicates a good buzz like divine judgment. In the Middle Ages, God wasn't just your spiritual overseer. He was head of internal affairs. And he had notes, lots of them. Religion said drunkenness was sinful. Then it handed you a chalice of wine and declared, "This is the blood of Christ." Cheers. Getting drunk at the tavern, sin. Getting drunk mid-prayer, mystical. A man wobbling in the marketplace was a disgrace, but wobbling in church, the Holy Spirit is moving through him. Moral standards were hand-painted by shaky hands. Whether your intoxication was holy or heretical depended mostly on your hat. Some women were labeled witches for brewing herbal anesthetics. Meanwhile, monks were grinding henbane to expand divine consciousness and writing 700-page theological dissertations no one would ever read. Both played with psychoactives. One wore a cross, the other wore a shawl. Guess who got burned? The church controlled more than beliefs. It curated emotions. Too happy, that's the devil tempting you. Too sad, clearly a lack of faith. The ideal mood was quiet guilt, preferably during a donation. Getting high, heresy. Getting high and seeing a vision, canonized. You might get painted on a chapel ceiling, glowing and tilting your head just right. A holy migraine. This wasn't prohibition. It was conditional permission. Get drunk in the wrong place, wrong mood, or wrong wardrobe and suffer. But do it in a robe with incense and mutter in Latin. Suddenly, you're spiritually enlightened. And like everything medieval, the line between salvation and punishment was a cough, or a look from someone judging your posture during Mass. Not everyone drank to forget. Some drank to remember what they never understood. Some boiled herbs to open mental doors. Others quietly sprinkled powdered leaves into their wine, not to sleep better, but to dream deeper. Deeper than any prayer could reach. And that's where the alchemists, monks, wandering healers, and pilgrims came in. In cold stone rooms by the flicker of candlelight, they boiled clear liquids, crushed dry leaves, and scribbled shaky notes like, "Use half next time," assuming there was a next time. The goal wasn't to get drunk, it was to pierce through reality, through the flesh, through layers of prepackaged belief. Some called it science, some called it sin. Most just kept stirring in silence. Experimenting with the spiritual via chemical means wasn't weird. When you don't have a microscope, you use instinct. When you don't have a university, you have caves and patience. Sometimes a potion meant to contact ancestors accidentally became the first painkiller. A powder meant to speak to the stars could unknowingly cure malaria. Nobody knew for sure, but they took notes and kept testing. For medieval minds, psychoactive substances weren't just escapes. They were walking sticks for the blind path of spiritual survival. Pilgrims carried pouches of holy water and vials of mind openers. They drank not to get lost, but to endure. When you're walking hundreds of miles in sheep-wool shoes and vague hope, a mild hallucination becomes essential luggage. Mystical rituals weren't rare either. Some monasteries had people chosen to receive visions. Others hosted silent vigils where participants shared doses, shared silence, and waited for a sign from the other side. The other side of what? No one knew. Maybe God. Maybe the self. Maybe a very well-organized collective delusion. These substances, whether prayed over wine or hand-ground herbs, served the same purpose, helping people survive a world that had no room for dreaming. Intoxication wasn't indulgence. It was a skill. The skill of blurring just enough to endure without losing the thread completely. And in that hazy space, between breaths, smoke, and whispered chants, medieval folks found a strange kind of survival. Spiritual survival, even when their bodies had long since given up. You probably imagine that medieval people fell into a drunken slumber after downing a few cups of mistletoe wine, dreaming of riding cows through foggy forests. Nice try. The drinking part, accurate. The long, uninterrupted sleep part, as rare as a peasant getting paid time off. After numbing reality with something mildly toxic and questionably fermented, they would drift into a kind of night. That was anything but continuous. To sleep in those days wasn't a journey from A to Z, it was more like going from A to M, making a surprise detour to X, saying hi to Q, hanging out briefly with Y, and if the stars aligned, looping back around to N. This wasn't chaos, it was routine. They called it first sleep, a stretch of slumber beginning at nightfall and ending somewhere around midnight. Then they woke up, not because their phone buzzed, not because their boss sent a late email, but simply because their body said, "That's enough for now." A fractured sleep, but not a frantic one. And no one freaked out about waking up at 1 a.m. No one Googled, "Does waking up at night mean I'm dying?" They just accepted it, quietly, as part of life. It wasn't a crisis, it was biology. In fact, sleeping through the night in one smooth chunk wasn't an ancient tradition. It was a side effect of the Industrial Revolution and the cursed invention of morning meetings. During the gap between the two sleeps, known as the watch, nobody screamed, "I have a sleep disorder." They got up, poured a bit of water if they had any, fluffed their straw if it hadn't molded, and let their mind wander into thoughts no one would ever record. Their bodies moved in rhythm with the natural light, and the natural light at midnight was nothing. But their minds stayed open, and that, right there, was the soft border between worlds. Half asleep and half awake, half dream and half memory, half gone and half thinking. Segmented sleep wasn't a problem. It was just biology before bulbs, before graveyard shifts, before emails marked urgent at 7:59 a.m. So if you've ever found yourself wide awake in the middle of the night, blinking into the dark like a Benedictine monk waiting for matins, congratulations. You're tapping into something ancient. A deep instinct buried under memory foam and blue light. And just like that, from the root-infused drinks of our previous tale, we now drift seamlessly into the quietest part of the night, where sleep begins by stopping halfway. You wake up at 2 a.m. not sleepy, not panicked. No need to scroll for a podcast titled "Soothe Your Nervous System in 3 Easy Steps." Because you're living in the 14th century, and waking up in the middle of the night is as normal as rats brushing past your ankles. Back then, people did all sorts of things during the white hour, the stretch between first and second sleep. Some prayed, some talked, some, well, made use of the only hour when the rest of the house was unconscious and they were conveniently awake. Letters got written during this time. So did daydreams, quiet regrets, and the occasional hushed existential panic. All processed in the dark where no one could see, and thankfully no one asked you to explain. Some went out into the garden, not to work out, but to stand quietly and stare into the fog, as if something in that gray hush might finally answer the question they never dared to ask in daylight. Others stoked the embers in the hearth, warmed their hands, and thought, "I'm still alive." And many, very many, just sat, breathing, waiting for sleep to return like a friend who got lost in the mist. There were no flashlights, no pulse monitoring apps, but also no anxiety about whether they'd hit their sacred 90-minute REM cycles. Waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a glitch, it was a window. A private world with no notifications, no guilt, and no performance metrics. It didn't need to be productive. It just was. The nobility prayed, monks chanted, the poor checked on the livestock, silently hoping the chickens hadn't been murdered. Children, if they woke up, might be told stories, not to fall asleep, but just to listen. It was a time the mind softened, like a lake smoothing over after wind. And if this all sounds strange to you, it's only because you live in a world that treats midnight awakenings like a software error. But to them, that moment was sacred. No alarms, no agenda, just a sliver of time between two tides, day and night. Wake and dream, where the soul could breathe without being told to go back to bed. Because who said sleep had to be seamless? That's just modernity talking. Somewhere along the way, we forgot. Waking up in the middle of the night isn't a failure. It's a small invitation to live just a little more in a place where no one is asking anything of you. After your little midnight stroll between two chunks of sleep, sipping questionable herbal tea, warming your hands over a dying fire, and whispering gossip to your neighbor in the dark, it was finally time to return to bed. Except calling it a bed might be generous. In the Middle Ages, what you slept on often looked more like a bird's nest than a piece of furniture. Forget spring mattresses. Forget memory foam. Forget turning over without hearing a creak that sounds like someone trying to escape prison. The most common bed, a wooden frame stuffed with straw if you were lucky. If not, say hello to a rough plank or a pile of animal skins that had already outlived 3 generations. A bedroom, that's a modern luxury. Medieval folks slept wherever the rain wasn't hitting them in the face. A corner of the kitchen, the attic, the stable, or right on the floor where the wind came in from every direction like it was testing your lungs for spiritual fortitude. Don't expect curtains either. Drafts, mist, and insects break-dancing on your forehead were all part of the all-inclusive sleep experience. Think your air conditioner is too loud? Try falling asleep to rats rustling, cats fighting over philosophical differences, roosters having a full-blown identity crisis at 2 a.m., and wind howling like a haunted monk outside your door. It was a nighttime symphony with no intermission, and you were the reluctant VIP guest. Central heating? Absolutely not. The closest thing was a small charcoal brazier, and if you slept too close, you'd wake up with half your hair mysteriously gone. Too far, and you'd shiver your way right out of first sleep before the second one could begin. Blankets weren't always. Blankets could be goat hide, could be your uncle's old cloak, could be a mysterious piece of cloth no one dared question. Pillows, technically yes, if you count a cloth sack stuffed with hay and existential disappointment. And yet somehow people slept. No white noise machines, no apps monitoring their heart rate. They just passed out from sheer exhaustion. So no, sleeping conditions back then weren't spa-level cozy. It was more like a survival challenge disguised as a nap. But somehow they lived, they dreamed, They fell in love, they breathed. And not once did they leave a one-star review for the accommodations. Sleep in the Middle Ages was rarely a solo act. In fact, it was more of a community event, whether you liked it or not. You didn't just sleep next to your spouse if you were lucky enough to have a room to yourselves. You might also sleep next to your mother, your children, your grandchildren, your grandfather, your cousin's toddler. And if it got really cold, some neighbors or a passing traveler whose name no one caught. At that point, the bed stopped being a place of rest and became more like a reluctant hostel. They called it communal sleeping for warmth. But let's be honest, it was snuggle or die. In a world where frostbite could casually claim your ears by dawn, having another body beside you was the line between waking up refreshed or not waking up at all. The blanket was a strategic resource. A thick, inherited from grandma, weighs as much as a goat kind of artifact, passed down like a national treasure. Fights over it were a leading cause of midnight leg kicks and possibly a few silent divorces. If you ended up on the edge of the bed, condolences. You had just been appointed chief wind blocker. Pillows were a competitive sport. Some households had exactly one. Whoever fell asleep first got it. Everyone else made do with rolled-up sleeves, straw bundles, or a bag filled with dirty laundry and broken dreams. Kids didn't have their own room. They were the bonus attachments on the main bed. They squirmed, cried, peed, and occasionally slept on your face without warning. Think sleeping next to a cat is tough. Try sharing space with a teething 3-year-old who doesn't believe in REM sleep or personal boundaries. As for privacy, forget it. Every breath, every turn, every whispered nightmare was a shared experience. If you screamed in your sleep, the entire household would greet you the next morning with the kind of knowing silence that says, "We heard everything." And yet, despite the chaos, the crammed limbs, the mystery elbows, people felt less alone. There was comfort in the sound of grandpa snoring, cousin grinding her teeth, and someone scratching at their leg like fleas were trying to solve a math problem. It was gross, it was loud, it was warm, and somehow it meant you were alive, that you belonged somewhere, that even in the tight squeeze of reality, moldy, drafty, unfiltered reality, sleep could still be a form of connection to people, to life, to something that, despite everything, still felt real. It's the dead of night. You finally slipped into your second sleep. No more tossing limbs. No toddler foot in your face, and then it happens. A little bite, not painful, just enough to wake you up. Then another. Then that unmistakable feeling. Something is crawling on you, and you know you're not alone. If the Middle Ages were a dinner party, lice and bedbugs were the VIP guests. They never showed up late, and they never left early. People lived with parasites the way we now live with bad Wi-Fi, annoyed, resigned, and slightly itchy. No one dreamed of extermination. The goal was simply to scratch with some level of dignity. Lice weren't just in hair. Oh no, they traveled far. Bedbugs didn't just camp beneath your straw pile. They took up residence in the walls, behind the blanket, and somewhere between the folds of your last remaining moral fiber. And fleas, the lesser-mentioned cousins, had a fondness for regions we won't name, but you'll definitely feel them. No one screamed, "Something bit me." People just scratched, casually, communally, strategically. Sometimes they upgraded to smacking, a firm, hopeful slap in the dark. That soft smack sound, not a mosquito, that was survival in progress. Some tried ashes, others dabbed vinegar, some whispered desperate prayers. None of it worked. Because lice and bedbugs weren't attracted to filth. They were attracted to people. And unless you were a hermit living on a rock, without straw, you were the buffet. Here's the unspeakable truth. Everybody had them. Class didn't matter. From kings to field hands, from monks to musicians, itching was the great equalizer. The only difference was in technique. The poor scratched publicly, the rich scratched politely, and the elderly learned to scratch in spirit. And maybe, just maybe, all that itching taught people a little humility. A reminder that no matter how big your bed or how thick your blanket, you're still part of a very small food chain. Because sleep in that world was never just about closing your eyes. It was about enduring. Enduring things smaller than you, faster than you, and entirely committed to ruining your peace. But people still slept, still dreamed. And come morning, they only asked for one thing, a working finger to scratch with. So you finally won your battle against the bedbugs, throwing a midnight rave under your blanket, and managed to drift back to sleep great. Now comes the fun part, the dream. But not the kind where you show up to school naked or fall off a cliff for no reason. No, medieval dreams were serious business. A message, a prophecy, a warning from above or below, depending on your level of holiness. Back then, people believed dreams were divine memos, and gods didn't use email. They preferred subconscious airmail. You dreamed of falling into a well, someone plotting against you. You dreamed of a snake, someone betraying you. You dreamed of eating raw lamb. Well, maybe you just forgot to eat dinner. Dreams weren't personal, they were public property. People shared them, recorded them, decoded them, and sometimes reported them to church authorities. There were even professional dream interpreters, often blessed with rich imaginations and zero filter. You said, "I dreamed of a well." They said, "Ah," symbolic of your emotional fluctuations and spiritual need for purification. You said, "I dreamed of bread." They replied, "A divine blessing is coming your way." Or maybe you're just hungry, hard to say. Of course, not all dreams were pleasant. Some came soaked in blood, fire, and the screams of unresolved afterlife debts. Instead of calling it job-related stress, people back then assumed it meant divine judgment was around the corner, or at least a revoked blessing. Sometimes it was just the cheese, but no one could be sure. Dreaming of a saint was an honor. Dreaming of a demon, also an honor, assuming you lived to tell about it. Some people's lives changed forever from one cryptic sentence in a dream. Others got locked in monasteries for saying the wrong dream at the wrong time. Wrong figure, wrong plot, wrong setting, and boom, you go from faithful believer to potential heretic before breakfast. But above all, dreams were one of the few ways medieval folks could speak to themselves without being accused of blasphemy. In a world where words were policed, Dreams were the last lawless playground of the mind. And you know what? Maybe you've had dreams like that too, but you've forgotten, because no one keeps a dream ledger anymore. No one wakes up at 3 a.m. to decode a talking goat. No one believes in handwritten notes from the divine. But that doesn't mean they've stopped sending them. So, you've just dragged yourself out of a medieval bed, riddled with lice, fleas, and dreams apparently fed X directly from divine sources. What's the first thing you need after a night of wrestling your own digestive system? Breakfast. Something, anything, that can make you forget the fact you just slept on what felt like a rat's fur coat with plumbing. Welcome, then, to our next chapter, Medieval Street Food, a world where grease was a belief system, and deep frying was the express lane to either stomach cramps or spiritual enlightenment, depending on your digestive optimism. No, medieval folks didn't have McDonald's, no KFC either. But what they did have was everything else thrown into hot fat. Anything that couldn't run fast enough got fried. If you were a carrot, you prayed daily. If you were an apple, you learned camouflage. And if you were flour, your fate was sealed the moment you existed. Street food back then didn't need logic. Just a pan of oil, a hand with no fear of burns, and a stomach with zero legal representation. These culinary experiments popped up in alleys, markets, castle gates. No permits, no masks. And absolutely no one asking if the vendor had scratched his head or his. Dignity before kneading the dough. And oddly enough, the poorer you were, the more creative your food got. People didn't cook to impress. They cooked to survive. They cooked with whatever they could find. Roots with no known name, animal fat past its moral expiration date, or flour swept up from the remains of 3 other bakeries. These weren't just meals. They were the edible results of desperation, chaos, and a hint of culinary genius that history forgot. There were no menus. You showed up, you looked, you guessed. Could be a donut, could be a cockroach croquette. No one knew, not even the seller. But if it was crispy and warm to the touch, you shrugged and took a bite. In a world where your sleep got interrupted by parasites, your food didn't need to follow any rules either. And so, from last night's messy bed, we walked straight into the open-air kitchen, where sizzling oil was the background music, and a hungry stomach was the only ticket required. Dreams may fade, but the sound of frying never lies. And if you listen closely, it's already calling us into the next chapter. You think the hardest part of street food is choosing between pizza or a burger. A medieval person would laugh if they still had the teeth for it. Because for them, the first question was, does this taste good? It was, will this kill me? There were no menus, no ingredient lists, and definitely no allergy disclaimers. All you had were your eyes, often nearsighted, and your gut instinct, often wrong. The only reliable method. Wait and watch someone else eat it first. If they were still breathing after a few minutes, maybe you'd give it a go. If they started twitching, hiccuping, then collapsed like an uprooted cabbage, then congrats. You just decided to go vegetarian today. A restaurant sign was a luxury. Most food stalls didn't have names, just smells. You followed the scent of burnt crust, scorched fat, and something that resembled deep-fried regret. And you'd probably find the place. Dishes had no official names either. One village called it fried dough. The next village called the same thing witch's underwear. No one argued, everyone laughed, then ate. You'd often see massive cauldrons boiling with a level of urgency that seemed to whisper, "Don't." But you approached anyway, sniffed, asked the price, and never got a straight answer. Pricing depended on the vendor's mood, the sun's position, and whether you accidentally mentioned a long-forgotten family feud. No tables, no napkins, no cheerful service. You ate standing up, holding something dripping grease, dodging a dog that looked at you like you were dessert. And if you dared ask, "What's in this?" the vendor would just smile. A smile you should never analyze too closely if you intend to keep your appetite. And the strangest part, it was still good. Not Michelin good, but desperation good. The kind of good that happens when you have no options, no time, and nothing left to lose but your faith in your stomach. In that world, eating was a gamble, and every bite was a bet. And that right there is how medieval folks mastered the most important culinary truth. If it fills you up, doesn't kill you, and makes you laugh just a little, it counts as food. If you think sushi is bold, imagine yourself in a tiny 14th century European village where the house specialty is something with legs, though it no longer walks, and the smell of courage. Because back then, food didn't come with expiration dates, it came with general conditions. Everything existed somewhere along a spectrum between freshly caught and might crawl off your plate. People ate whatever they could find, not for the love of gastronomy, but out of sheer bone-deep fear of starving to death. Trees, roots, bark, mushrooms, leaves, even moss, if you knew how to boil it right and pray hard enough. And the best part, they still called it a dish. A dish of what? No one was quite sure. Could be forest porridge, mother's soup, or whatever we found this morning. Meat was no exception. Fresh meat was a luxury. Most of it was somewhere on the journey toward becoming spirit. Pig, sheep, bird, anything that could be caught, tripped, or simply gave up. Every part of the animal got used. Tongue, brain, intestines, heart, lungs, not out of love for organ meats, but because saying no meant. Saying goodbye, spices, sure, if you were rich. Otherwise, you might add sawdust for texture or sprinkle in some fireplace ash for personality. Some traditional dishes were so traditional that nobody remembered where they came from. Only the sensation afterward. Full stomach, watery eyes, and a vague questioning of your life choices. There were dishes no one even dared to name, because giving them names made them too real. So instead, they were cooked quietly, ladled out quietly, and eaten quietly, everyone watching each other like they were waiting for a divine sign. And if no one collapsed after 10 minutes, that was the sign to make it again. But don't get it twisted. Medieval folks weren't clueless about food. They had a very specific skill set, surviving dinner. No need for refined palates. Just animal instinct. A resilient immune system, and a soul that didn't ask too many questions. And from this humble truth, that a good meal doesn't need premium ingredients, fancy plating, or culinary theory. It just needs to not make you vomit. you begin to understand the real philosophy of medieval dining. If it stays down, it counts. Of course, after surviving a high-risk meal, without needing a priest to read your last rites, the medieval diner had one more challenge to face: table etiquette. Now, you might imagine that people back then ate in polite silence, elbows tucked at perfect 90-degree angles, sipping from goblets like characters in a period drama. They didn't. They ate like every meal might be their last, because sometimes it was. At a medieval dining table, you could expect the following: someone licking their knife to make sure not a single good bit went to waste, someone reaching across the table into your food like it was a God-given right, and if you hesitated for even a second, your portion might vanish before your next breath. Etiquette existed, but it followed its own logic. For instance, don't fling bones at someone's head unless they're your close friend. Don't wipe your hands on the cat unless the cat is already dead. And absolutely no spitting into the fireplace unless you're trying to expel evil spirits that live there totally legitimate, apparently. The upper class might have tablecloths, not for wiping hands, but to cover up whatever unspeakable stains were already there. They had personal cups, personal spoons, sometimes even a personal food taster in case poisoning was trending that week. But for most people, nothing was personal. The table, communal, the food, shared, and even the unexpected cough during dinner, a group experience. Food was eaten with hands. Knives were for cutting and occasionally for intimidation. Forks. Oh no, forks were viewed as Satan's cutlery. Using a fork could get you labeled a heretic. Bringing a fork to a medieval feast was like showing up to a ritual sacrifice with a USB stick, useless, and guaranteed to make people stare. In conversation, not everyone got to talk. Usually, whoever had the wine had the microphone. Common topics included death, failed harvests, and ghost sightings. Conversations rarely ended on a high note. Usually someone just let out a belch loud enough to rattle a window. Not rude, mind you, that was a survival gesture, a way of saying, I made it. Meals didn't end with dessert. They ended with physical collapse. Some folks reclined, others slumped, and if you didn't pass out, you had to clean up. Nobody waited for sunset, just for the fullness to settle and the threat of food poisoning to subside. So next time you see someone eating with their hands, double dipping, or wiping their mouth on their sleeve, try not to judge. They might just be honoring an ancient survival ritual passed down from ancestors who dined in a world where vinegar wine was considered gourmet. And after the meal ends with a sacred burp, the medieval soul is faced with a question humanity has never truly resolved. Where do you go to go? No signs, no toilets that sing to you. No magical Japanese buttons that turn your bathroom trip into a spa experience. Just a general medieval concept, somewhere far enough away. The idea of a toilet in the Middle Ages was like a joke told by someone who had never heard of hygiene. If you were lucky enough to live in a castle, it might be a hole in the wooden floor leading straight to the moat below, where fish and rats held monthly cross-species conventions. In a regular home, a bucket, a pit, or anywhere you could turn around without someone watching. Sewage system? Absolutely not. Water? Sure, if you count rain dripping off the roof or yesterday's vegetable rinse. Flush? A concept no one thought of because everything just kind of flushed itself, usually down towards someone else's boots. Smell? Oh, don't even start. If you think modern public restrooms are the peak of olfactory trauma, try imagining a tiny room with no ventilation, filled with centuries of drafty air and someone who had goat cheese 3 days ago. Now multiply that by 400 years. You're getting close. In some places, human waste was recycled as fertilizer, economical. If you're the kind of person who can ignore the crushing psychological burden, horse manure, cow dung, anything that dropped from anything was scooped up into the communal pile, treated like some kind of national treasure. And if you slipped and fell in it, good luck. You might find spiritual rebirth, or at least an urgent need to reevaluate your life choices. The nobility had closed stools, a high-tech solution consisting of a wooden chair with a hole in the middle, placed right there in the room. You de-sit, relieve yourself, and ponder life's mysteries. Nobody saw a contradiction in dropping poetic lines next to dropping other things. Maybe it was because the poetry back then digested quickly, too. And at night was prime time for poor decisions. Go too far outside and you might fall into a ditch. Stay in bed and you'll lie awake wondering what sins from a past life led to this bladder purgatory. The solution? A chamber pot, tucked neatly under the bed, private, accessible, and perfectly designed to be kicked in a half-asleep stupor. And yes, some people, we won't name names, used urine to do laundry. The logic: it neutralizes odor. The reality: it really doesn't. And there you have it. A society with no toilets, no rolls of quilted comfort, no soft cleanse options. But somehow people lived, loved, ate more, reproduced, and against all odds, still managed to feel proud of their civilization. Because if you can poop into a hole in the floor while reciting Latin verses, maybe you've truly transcended. If you think bathing in the Middle Ages was a simple act, walk into a room, turn a knob, hit play on your spa playlist, and sink into lavender-scented foam, well, congratulations, you're off by about 800 years. Back then, taking a bath was an event. It required planning, coordination, and occasionally bravery. First, just finding clean water was a miracle. Well water ran deep. River water came with a bonus medley of floating logs, dead leaves, and someone's moldy bread from last week. Rainwater was sometimes used, but only after going through an invisible purification ritual known as leave a bucket in the yard and pray no birds fly over it. Next came the boiling. Because cold water was the enemy, you'd haul buckets of water, heat them pot by pot, pour them into a wooden barrel, and stir it like you were making human soup. And if you're picturing your own personal tub, I'm sorry, this was a group activity. You shared with family, with neighbors, and if you were poor, with any small animal that happened to fall in by accident. Body wash? Nope. Soap, if you had any, was usually made from animal fat and lye and smelled like regret. Back scrubbers? Use your hands, shampoo, wood ash, towel, maybe yesterday's shirt, privacy, never heard of her. Public bathhouses, yes, public were gathering places where people didn't just scrub down. They gossiped, they negotiated, they even flirted. Bathing wasn't just hygiene, it was a networking opportunity. A steamy, bacteria-rich, fully communal experience everyone somehow agreed was fine. In larger towns, you might even find bathhouses with signs boldly declaring, "Water changed every few weeks." If no number was listed, don't ask. As for the question of who got to bathe first, it's simple. Whoever had more money came out cleaner. Then the church got suspicious. Too many naked bodies, too much laughter, too much steam-based joy. Clearly, this was Satan's doing. Bathing became associated with moral decay. So people pivoted. They washed their hands with prayer, their faces with hope, and spritzed themselves with burning incense and good intentions. The result? An entire century that smelled, historically pungent. And yet, despite the water scarcity, the soap scarcity, and the absolute extinction of personal space, people still wanted to be clean. They still tried. They still boiled water, wiped the dust off their skin, scraped off the grime. Because deep down, even surrounded by filth, humanity clung to this strange belief that maybe, just maybe, they could shine. If not bright, then at least a little less dull than yesterday. These days, you spray perfume to impress a date, make a statement, or hide the lingering scent of instant noodles from your hoodie. But in the Middle Ages, smelling good wasn't about seduction. It was a declaration, a social broadcast, a way of shouting into the room, "I'm not dead, at least not yet." Because back then, if you smelled nice, it didn't mean you de-bathed. It meant you had money. Perfume wasn't for people who used soap. It was for people who didn't want to. A dab on the sleeve, a touch behind the ear, not to attract lovers, but to survive a town hall full of 20 people, one wooden door and zero ventilation. And that perfume, it didn't come from Paris. It came from a brass pot over a smoky stove, brewed like a curse with ingredients that sound like rejected Hogwarts electives. Ambergris, yes, from a whale's gut. Musk, from a deer's butt gland. And sometimes resin mixed with goat fat. It didn't smell nice in the modern sense, but it was distinct. People believed fragrance could ward off disease because bad smells, according to medieval medicine, were where illness lived. So if you reeked like a dying herb garden on fire, you were protecting yourself. That was the logic. In a world with no microscopes, scent was your only immune system. And the nobles, oh, they went all in. Scented gloves, scented hats, scented letters. Some wore necklaces filled with sponges soaked in perfume, essentially an aromatic air filter for the horrors of everyday life. One noblewoman was said to never leave her house unless she had marinated in 5 different fragrances. Her motto, "If I die of the plague, I'll die fabulous." But perfume wasn't just for health, it was camouflage. It hid the truth, that you hadn't bathed, that your outfit had been glued to your body since spring, that your flesh was sending distress signals only goats could hear. A well-layered aroma became a cloak of decency. And in that world, smell equaled morality. If you smelled good, you were clean. If you were clean, you were good. Strange, isn't it? That something invisible, ungraspable, became the proof of character. As if ethics wasn't in your actions but in the trail of scent you left behind. And if you think that's outdated, think of the last time you picked a shampoo labeled refresh instead of rebuild damaged trust. Deep down, maybe some part of you still believes that what you smell like says something about who you are. So you've perfumed yourself, shaved every visible patch of dignity, slicked on wax, combed your hair into submission. And now you're sitting in a room lit by 47 candles made of sheep fat and whispered prayers. You think that's enough? Oh no, sweet summer pilgrim. In the Middle Ages, beauty wasn't about looking good. It was about looking wrong on purpose, but in style. Beauty standards back then were the longest-running practical joke in history, except no one laughed, because they thought it was serious. Want to be considered attractive? Shave your forehead. That's right, high foreheads were noble, not because people liked foreheads, but because they equated refined with looking like a peeled egg. Still not fancy enough. Pluck your eyebrows, sometimes all of them, so you could achieve that heavenly, emotionless angel face. And if you're still not oozing aristocratic energy, bleach your hair until it's the color of despair. Then comb it leftward like a medieval tax collector mourning his quill. And let's talk about skin tone. The paler, the better. The more you looked like you just crawled out of a crypt after surviving plague and heartbreak, the more elite you were. Tanned skin. That meant labor, and labor wasn't pretty. So people smeared their faces with vinegar, lead powder, and anything vaguely toxic, then acted shocked when their skin fell off like confetti. Clothing was a competition to see who could suffer the most while still pretending to smile. Sleeves dragged across the floor like existential dread. Hats reached heights that made architectural sense only to wizards. Shoes, pointed, like really pointed. The famous pooling shoes could stab someone from across a tavern. Not that you would. Violence was too exhausting. You didn't wear them to walk. You wore them to say, I've never had to run from anything except responsibility. The rich wore fur, not because they were cold, but because showing off dead animals was the Gucci of the 1300s. A noblewoman might wear 3 layers of gowns weighing more than your ex's emotional baggage. Meanwhile, the poor wore whatever wasn't actively disintegrating. Occasionally, their outfits were just the leftovers still clinging to a neighbor's clothesline. And yet everyone chased these standards, even when they made no sense, even when they were itchy, restrictive, and borderline fatal, because beauty was a belief system, no proof required. And if you had to endure bleeding pores, flammable headwear, and public judgment just to be called graceful, well, that was the price of elegance. Sound familiar? Today, we've swapped out lead for retinol, fire hazard hats for ring lights, and medieval eyebrow annihilation for 24-step skincare routines. But the spirit remains. People still plump their lips, rub acid on their cheeks, and pose under solar-powered light rigs, wondering why their face no longer feels natural. Times change, but the beauty dream still just as weird. You thought only modern folks suffer for beauty. Think again. Medieval people turned pain into a fashion statement, not because they enjoyed torture, but because they genuinely believed beauty required blood, sweat, and the occasional blackout. Let's start with the early corset, or more accurately, the medieval chest binder that squeezed you so tightly. You weren't sure if you were breathing through your lungs or sheer faith. It didn't just shape your body, it reshaped your personality. If you collapsed from lack of oxygen, congratulations, you'd officially been labeled graceful. And once your waist was sufficiently suffocated, let's talk shoes. Remember the pointy poolings from earlier? They weren't footwear. They were patience training. Walking in them was like maneuvering through your regrets, slow, uncertain, and absolutely never turning around. Because if you did, you might impale yourself on your own hemline. Women endured layers upon layers of clothing. Summer or winter didn't matter. A proper lady might wear 6 full layers, not to keep warm, but to keep up appearances. Feeling hot, too bad, itching, internalize it. Fainting from lack of oxygen, please do so with elegance. And makeup, oh, it was glamorous, if your idea of glam is lead powder, sulfur paste, and substances that should never be near your digestive tract. Women lost teeth, hair, and sometimes even the ability to focus. But as long as you looked noble, who cared? A pale, emotionless face on the verge of passing out was peak beauty. You were supposed to look like a forgotten statue, but an expensive one. Men didn't get off easy either. They wore padded tunics, short skirts, yes, skirts, and hats tall enough to host a family of sparrows. Some hairstyles required shaving half the head, making them look like they lost a bet. But hey, it was called religious flair. And the scariest part, no one thought any of this was weird. Just like today, where someone injects their face and calls it natural. Back then, if you winced because your corset was crushing your ribs, someone would glance over and whisper, "Now that's a proper lady." Because pain, whether subtle or screaming, has always been part of the beauty game. And nothing was more admired than being squeezed into an ideal while smiling politely, even as your internal organs politely asked to be excused. In an age where bathing was considered suspicious behavior, perfume wasn't just about smelling good. It was spiritual armor, a fragrant line of defense, a silent declaration that went something like, I may not have control over my taxes, my health, or my future, but I still control how I smell. Medieval folks firmly believed that body odor was a sign of sin, or disease, or possibly both. Not everyone had the right to stink. If you were poor and smelled bad, you were part of the unclean masses. But if you were a nobleman and carried the rich scent of horse stable with a hint of despair, people would nod and say, "Ah, he must be deep in spiritual contemplation." And because public bathhouses were low on the budget priority list, somewhere between pave the road and burn the heretic, perfume became the people's solution. Not the delicate designer kind we know today. No, we're talking about experimental mixtures of crushed roots, animal musk, and ingredients that honestly should have been kept miles away from any functioning nostril. If you've ever wondered what fermented sheep fat and burnt incense would smell like together, congrats. You've just traveled back to the Middle Ages. They didn't just dab it behind the ears. Oh no. They sprayed it on collars, cloaks, pillows, and even gloves, because handshakes were common, and no one wanted their hand to smell more appealing than their entire face. Some gloves were so heavily perfumed that a single wave goodbye could clear nearby wildlife. But of course, perfume was a privilege. The poor couldn't afford rare oils or imported resins. They burned herbs, they carried garlic, or just hoped the wind was in their favor. The middle class got creative with concoctions that smelled like they'd already died and come back for a second chance. There was a fragrance called Silent Night, which was, in fact, vinegar steeped with tree sap and blind optimism. If it didn't spontaneously combust when exposed to fire, it was considered a hit. And since everyone knew full well that they couldn't be completely scent-free, society developed a new skill: polite sniffing. You had to learn how to evaluate someone's smell without changing facial expression. There were even diplomatic ways of doing it. Your scent today is contemplative, or you smell like someone who's just returned from battle, victorious, I hope. Smelling someone was a social test. Too fragrant, you're hiding something. Subtle aroma, you're balanced. Smelling like reality, you're clearly a peasant. And thus the art of scent-based living was born. Not bathing, that's fine. But don't ever sniff wrong. Because in a world where your nostrils doubled as moral compasses, losing control of your scent meant losing your dignity. Today, you wear a mask for health reasons. In the Middle Ages, they wore it for style. The kind of style that screams terrified of dying but still wants to look good while doing it. When the Black Death came knocking, it didn't tap gently. It kicked down the door and wiped out half the village. People had two choices: curl up like a scared onion, or upgrade their wardrobe, and thus plague-era fashion was born. Grim, bizarre, and noticeable from a very safe distance. The most iconic look, the plague doctor. These fine gentlemen sported floor-length black robes, wide-brimmed hats, and a face mask with a giant beak, like a crow who moonlights at Comic-Con. That beak wasn't for scaring children, it was a proto-air filter. Inside, dried herbs, rose petals, citrus peels, and occasionally powdered sandalwood. Basically, if the disease didn't go away, at least you'd smell delightful while dying. But the deathbird aesthetic was just the start. The general population got creative with their survival accessories. Vinegar-soaked rags to cover the nose, dangling talismans, triple-layered coats because viruses hate heavy fabric, and some people even stuffed onions into their pockets, convinced they'd absorb disease, which they did along with flies. The tension in the air was so thick that fashion became a form of biostrategy. You didn't dress to impress. You dressed to say, I'm still alive and actively trying to stay that way. Even if that meant tying a bunch of garlic to your belt like you were headed to slay Dracula at 3 and pick up eggs at 4. And the funniest part, everyone pretended to be calm. They walked around in scented rags, painted sigils on their jackets, and strutted to the market with all the serenity of a suburban stroll, while carts of corpses rolled by behind them. Because deep down, they all knew. Fashion wouldn't save them, but it gave the illusion of control. And sometimes, illusion is the only thing left between you and full-blown despair. Still breathing, Good, because up next, when medieval folks couldn't sleep, they prayed. They dreamed of divine signs. They sniffed herbs and somehow they survived. Don't ask how, they just did. If you're still alive after all the previous parts, it means you slept in segmented shifts like an insomniac monk, been scratched by freeloading bugs who paid no rent, shared a bed with at least 3 strangers, and a toddler who didn't grasp the concept of not kicking people in the face. At 3 a.m., had hellish dreams but still woke up to go to work. And finally, wore the scent of rotting sandalwood just to hit up a medieval marketplace. Congratulations, you're officially medieval. Because surviving that era wasn't about the strong eat the weak. It was about knowing when to scratch, how to share a blanket without starting a blood feud, and how to sniff vinegar without throwing up. To survive meant you woke up even if you had no idea why. You left your house even though nobody promised you'd make it back. You dreamed weird stuff and still got jolted awake by a rooster having an existential crisis. And in a world where sleep was a multi-leg journey, bed bugs were your bunkmates, and fashion was a survival tactic, miracles didn't look like magic. They looked like people who still had a sense of humor. Medieval folks didn't have much, but they had each other. They had smells. They had dreams. They had the sound of someone breathing beside them in a room with not enough blankets, and they had belief that maybe tomorrow would be better, or not, but still worth trying. So if you're listening to this part now, during some restless modern night, with your whisper quiet AC, memory foam mattress, and hydration app gently reminding you to sip water every hour, take just 1 second to be grateful, not because you're bug-free, but because you can still laugh hearing about people who once tried to survive in the weirdest, itchiest, most inconvenient ways possible. And if tonight you wake at 2 a.m., unable to sleep again, get up, pour some water, look out the window, and whisper to the darkness, "I get it, and I'm still here." You think the medieval survival story ends when someone dodges the plague, eats a fried something of questionable origin, and manages to walk in pointy shoes without tripping. Oh no, that was just the warm-up act. Because surviving the Middle Ages wasn't enough, you had to live with the smell of yourself. Welcome to the next chapter, where history wasn't written in ink, it was written in odor. It didn't begin with a grand battle or a lavish banquet. It began with something much more human, much more personal, much more haunting, personal hygiene. And trust me, you haven't truly understood what that means until you've heard about garlic. Yes, not perfume. Not 3-layer body wash with hints of jasmine. Garlic, the clove, mashed, rubbed, worn, hung around your neck like a cross between a medieval air freshener and a spiritual restraining order. Garlic was a scent, a statement, and a shield all in one. "I smell like this on purpose," it said, because back then you didn't get many choices. You didn't choose where you were born. You didn't choose a night without bed bugs. You didn't choose who got to share your bed or your pillow or your lice. But you could choose what you smelled vaguely like. And if the options were vaguely garlicky or abandoned animal carcass chic, then garlic was practically a public service. Medieval people didn't categorize scent by social class. They did it by intensity. The stronger the smell, the stronger the person, or at least, the less likely they were to be bothered. And so we entered an era with no French perfume, no scented candles, no refreshing body sprays, but a vast selection of folk remedies designed to turn your body into its own weather system. And this was just the beginning. I haven't even told you about how bathing was so rare. It was basically considered a rite of spiritual transformation. Bathing, such a simple concept. For modern folks, it's a reward after a long day. A chance to relax, belt out a few off-key songs, and maybe ruin your phone with a misplaced splash. But for medieval people, bathing was a high-stakes game, a date with destiny, a gamble in which bacteria often came out on top. At first, bathing was just a habit. There were public bathhouses, wooden tubs, hot water boiled over charcoal fires, ready to turn anyone into a sort of spiritual stew. People gathered not to exfoliate, but to gossip about crop failures, the neighbor's cow, and occasionally flirt with someone by soaking rosemary in warm water like medieval cologne. Bathing used to be a social event, a place where you didn't just scrub your skin, you rinsed away rumors. Did miss a bathe with Mr. B? That's barely a footnote, as long as there was water and some metaphorical ice to break social tension. But then, the church looked into the bathhouse and didn't see cleanliness. They saw sin. They saw temptation. They saw far too much exposed flesh for comfort. And so slowly the bathhouses closed. Water became suspicious, and bathing, once a healthy routine, turned into a cursed ritual. You think people were sad? Nope. They adapted. They invented dry bathing. No water, no soap. Just a brisk rub with a cloth and a heartfelt prayer. One man even bragged, "I haven't bathed in 3 moon cycles and I'm still alive." Technically true, but no one wanted to verify that with their nose. They sweated, rubbed with salt, slathered on herbs, burned incense, wore perfumed gloves, anything to avoid direct contact with water, because water meant illness, and illness meant death. Therefore, the logical conclusion, bathing equals death. You're laughing, don't. The modern world has its own version. Someone eats one bad salad and vows to live exclusively off French fries. The logic hasn't changed, just the seasoning. And so, medieval folks carried on unbathed, untouched by moisture, and genuinely convinced that not cleaning themselves kept them intact, at least physically. As for the spirit, well, that required a different kind of cleansing, one that didn't involve soap. After bathing became a morally questionable act that might lead to extinction, medieval folks turned to another form of purification, fragrance, but not the luxurious kind with fancy labels like eau de toilette. No, we're talking about aromas that might make the dead hesitate before moving on, just to sniff. In a world without deodorant, without detox body wash, and definitely without hashtags like clean girl, scent took on an almost divine significance. Smell wasn't just smell, it was a sign, a prophecy, a whisper from the heavens saying, this person is still alive and possibly a saint. Let's not misunderstand. This fragrance wasn't pleasant in any way you recognize. It didn't smell like spring meadows or mom's cookies. It smelled like bruised roots, fermented deer oil, and cremation ash laced with wilted flowers. But if you caught a whiff of it, you'd think, this one takes the afterlife very seriously. Monks and holy folk of the time believed that sanctified bodies would emit a pleasant aroma, known as the odor of sanctity. The problem, no one could quite define what that odor actually was, which meant anyone smelling remotely different, even if it was just because they ate too much garlic, could be considered canonization material. There are records of martyrs whose corpses allegedly gave off a sweet scent years after death. What those records don't say is that their bodies were soaked in herbal oil and parked next to 12 incense sticks 24/7. But hey, who needs details when you've got a miracle? On the flip side, if your scent didn't fit the moral mold, you might be considered possessed, especially if you were a woman who smelled like blooming flowers in midwinter. Immediate red flag. How could someone smell good without bathing or doing laundry, clearly hiding something or someone? And so, scent became a medieval caste system. Smell like sanctity, you're a believer. Smell like mystery, probably a witch. Smell like nothing, suspicious. Smell too good, burn now, ask questions later. People went to church with incense holders, flower-laced pendants, gloves soaked in oils, not to attract others, but to avoid getting labeled demonic. Because in an era where body odor could be used as evidence in religious court, knowing how to smell was a survival skill. So yes, if in the last chapter they feared bathing, in this one they sparkled without it. Through scent, through smoke, through unwavering faith that smelling holy equals being holy. And if you weren't actually clean, at least you smelled the part. Next up, welcome to a world where smelling divine isn't enough and people begin wearing tall hats, floor-length robes, and onion pouches to dodge death itself. After spritzing themselves with holy fragrances and dusting on fireplace ash like they were marinating for reincarnation, medieval folks entered a new era, one where scent alone just didn't cut it anymore. Because an uninvited guest had shown up, didn't knock, didn't text, and most importantly, refused to leave. The Black Death. So when death was knocking and sometimes kicking at your door, what was the logical thing to do? Stay inside. Pray, fast, bathe. No, they changed outfits. Thus was born the era of plague fashion, dark, dramatic, and impossible to launder. The ultimate plague runway icon, the plague doctor. A figure that made you deeply question whether medicine was a legitimate profession or an elaborate prank. With a beaked mask that looked like a depressed seagull in cosplay, stuffed with dried herbs, flowers, sometimes citrus peel, and occasionally blind hope in the antibacterial power of onion skins. The goal, not to treat disease, but to avoid the stench. Did it work? That's like asking, has anyone ever breathed through a leather bird's snout and lived to tell the tale? Unclear. Black robes, thick gloves, wide-brimmed hats, goggles, not for protection, but to look like you knew what you were doing. In reality, no one knew anything. But the more you covered yourself up, the more others assumed you had. Survival figured out. And what about regular folks? They tied scented pouches to their belts, hung garlic from their necks, wrapped cloth around their arms like DIY, disease-fighting ninjas. Some even wore masks made of bark or beeswax, as if the bees had graduated from med school and were now running the CDC. The most popular accessory, not earrings, vinegar, soaked into cloth, stuffed up nostrils, wiped across doors, or simply used as a sniff and hope system. The theory was, if the smell is strong enough to offend you, it might offend death too. It didn't work, but at least death would be slightly annoyed before claiming your soul. Dressing during a plague was no longer about looking good. It was about broadcasting one desperate message. I'm trying my best. Fabric armor that didn't protect your lungs but gave you the illusion that you were fighting back. And sometimes, that illusion was the only weapon you had left. They moved through clouds of superstition and musk, eyes wary, posture stiff. Some were dressed head to toe, not just to cover their bodies but to conceal their terror. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew, if we can't stop death, at least we can look decent while waiting. And so, from bathhouses without water, to fragrances meant to fend off evil spirits, the medieval world now draped itself in its final layer, the fashion of desperate hope. But don't turn out the lights just yet, because the next chapter takes you somewhere even darker than plague couture, into a world where sleep was shattered into pieces, and the room everyone feared was their own. By day, medieval people feared disease, but by night, they feared everything else. Night wasn't a time for rest. It was a kingdom of uncertainty where gods whispered, bedbugs feasted. And every creak in the dark made your heart book a doctor's appointment before the doctor even arrived in town. When the sun went down, the world didn't just get darker, it changed. First, the light vanished. No electricity, no convenient oil lamps, no smartphone flashlight, just candles. And candles are not something you want in hand when you're running from something with claws. The flickering flame didn't chase away the darkness. It only highlighted the things you really didn't want to see. A scratch on the door, a shadow that didn't belong, or a pair of eyes staring back from under the bed. Next came the sounds. In complete silence, everything sounds suspicious. A cat screeching like a kidnapped toddler. The wind hissing through cracks in the door like someone chanting an ancient curse. The creaking ceiling, maybe it was a rat, or maybe it was your ancestors dropping by. Either way, it was not something you wanted to investigate. Medieval folks believed night was when souls wandered, spirits that hadn't crossed over, vampires looking for new lovers, witches holding board meetings, and goblins just bored. So when night fell, people lit incense, sealed their windows, drew protective symbols, and above all, never went to pee alone, unless they were ready to share the outhouse with a jealous spirit. Kids were told never to point into the dark because it might think you're calling. Adults didn't say the names of the dead after sunset because they might answer. And if you heard someone calling your name from the yard at midnight, don't respond. If it's someone alive, they'll knock. If it's something else, you really don't want to know. Then there was the strangest light of all, the one inside your sleep. Because even when you lay down, you weren't truly free of the night. You dreamed. And in dreams, you saw things best left unseen. A field soaked in blood, a dead relative beckoning you inside. Or worse, yourself standing at the door watching you sleep. People say, don't believe what you see at night. But medieval folks knew whatever happened in the night, real or not, left a mark. A strange tightness in the chest, a breath you didn't recognize, a scratch on your leg that you didn't remember getting. And when morning came, with roosters proudly declaring that the world hadn't ended yet, people didn't wake with relief. They woke with one unsettling question: was last night real? Still, they carried on. Ate breakfast fried in recycled oil. Put on another layer of clothing steeped in dried soul fragrance. And went back to sleep as if the night wasn't terrifying at all. Because surviving in that time often meant mastering the art of ignoring things you shouldn't touch. After surviving a night filled with howling winds, mysterious bone creaks, and whispered voices from someone not exactly present, you wake up, eat burnt bread, and look at the person lying next to you. Not because of love, but because they're still there after last night. And in medieval terms, that was enough to call it marriage. Love in the Middle Ages didn't come from swiping right. It came from plowed fields, property exchanges, and a list of romantic questions like, how many cows does your family own? Have you had the plague yet? And are we blood relatives? Hopefully not. Weddings weren't celebrations of affection. They were legal transactions, basically a stock exchange with more flowers and fewer choices. Families met, signed things, exchanged candles, drank too much wine, and then shoved two strangers into a room where they weren't allowed to sleep without at least 3 witnesses posted outside the door. Privacy was a luxury. Emotional connection was a post-ceremony bonus. The wedding bed, that's where ritual ended and reality began. 2 people, often strangers, sometimes with a large age gap or differing smallpox histories, lay side by side in a room as cold as church logic. And once the breathing slowed and the bystanders backed away, they began to count the layers of fabric, because wedding clothes weren't meant to be taken off. They were a challenge, a textile puzzle. Undershirt, overshirt, petticoat, coat, sash, bow, buttons, and if you were lucky, wooden fasteners. Solid wood, real wood, wood that did not believe in speed. Sex wasn't recreation. It was duty. Evidence of marriage, and sometimes the reason you ended up with 8 children and no lower back. Emotional expression had to be done in silence, unless you wanted the neighbors to report you to the church for unholy sounds. And if you thought divorce was an option, please take a number. Fill out paperwork the length of the Old Testament. Submit it to 3 levels of ecclesiastical authority, and provide proof that you were possessed, tricked, or already dead. Still, some couples fell in love anyway. Not because they chose each other once, but because they chose each other again after every winter, every child born, every failed harvest. They shared glances while peeling potatoes. They brushed hands while scratching lice. And they understood love wasn't falling flower petals. It was the person who still tolerated your scent after 4 days without a bath. So in the midst of arranged unions, painfully quiet nights, and stares that lost their sparkle, something like love still existed. Or if not love, then at least a kind of patience that smelled deeply human. Medieval children grew up fast, and sometimes they grew up just to learn how to be afraid the correct way. Because in a society where almost anything could be blamed on the devil, even your dreams were subject to investigation. You think dreaming about flying means your spirit is free. Nope. It means you're probably being lured by dark forces. Dreamed you were talking to a dog. Modern psychology might say you're lonely. But in those days, you were a low-level witch in training. Religion in the Middle Ages wasn't some soft white robe of comfort. It was a thick, itchy wool blanket of judgment. And if you so much as shifted under it, someone might accuse you of displaying signs of heretical fidgeting. Had a nightmare. It wasn't the moldy cheese you ate. It was sin leaking through your subconscious. It meant the devil knocked on your soul during REM. And if you dared describe a dream involving fire, blood, or dead relatives, don't be surprised when a robed man with unshakable faith shows up at your door, holding a crucifix and a suspicion that you should be either confessing or floating. Dreamed you were laughing. Big problem, because joy in your sleep was interpreted as avoiding penitence. Dreamed of an angel. If you were a peasant, liar. If you were nobility, congratulations. Someone might ask you to rewrite the town's official history. And here's the best part. Sometimes you didn't dream at all, but someone else dreamed about you, and just like that, you could be arrested for appearing suspicious in someone else's dream. Imagine sitting quietly, sipping your diluted tea, and someone says, "I dreamed she was a flying cat." Next thing you know, you're hanging upside down while they check you for fur. The line between dream, vision, and blasphemy was razor thin. They held dream tribunals, not to help you understand yourself, but to determine if you deserved firewood and an audience. The wrong dream told at the wrong time with the wrong witnesses was a one-way ticket to the stake. You may not have been a witch, but you sure slept like one. So medieval folks learned not to dream, or at least not to mention it. They slept like they were on a covert mission. No twitching, no talking, no suspicious facial expressions. And if they woke in the middle of the night, they muttered prayers not for peace, but as a kind of spiritual GPS check-in to prove they were still on God's side. In that world, deep sleep was dangerous. Light sleep meant freezing. No sleep meant madness. And sleeping with dreams meant your odds of becoming ash were significantly increased. So if you're lying awake in your temperature-controlled room, next to a sound machine playing pine forest ambience, sipping chamomile tea, be grateful, because your worst nightmare tonight won't end with a trial by belief. After nightmares were branded as demonic postcards, medieval people sometimes didn't sleep, but for perfectly mundane reasons: hunger, cold, or because a politically ambitious bedbug decided to stage a coup on their inner thigh. And on those nights, when the bed stopped being shelter and dreams were one-way tickets to a heresy tribunal, they resorted to the oldest survival method in the book: staying awake. Not staying up in the modern sense, binge-watching 3 seasons of a show, because sleeping now would betray my youth. No, they stayed up like creatures who knew that falling asleep might mean never waking up again. And in the flickering oil lamp glow, they'd look up at the sky not for romance, but to check for signs of the apocalypse. Because back then, everything from crop failure to weird dreams was considered a message from God. And every shooting star was basically a DM from the other side. Looking at the sky was like scrolling through divine social media, just with a light-year delay. You never knew who sent what, but you kept scrolling, just in case. It was meant for you. Medieval folks had a special relationship with the heavens. They didn't call it astronomy. They called it divine intent. If stars aligned, good omen. If the moon turned red, someone's about to die or get married. Or both. Basically, they treated the sky like we treat weekly horoscopes. Don't fully believe it, but don't dare ignore it either. But stargazing wasn't the only purpose. Night was the only time everything fell quiet. Even the teeth grinding of great-grandmother in the bed next to you. And when the world hushed, the bugs paused their agenda. And the wind sighed instead of screamed. Your mind was finally allowed to wander. You'd think about tomorrow, that torn shirt you still hadn't patched, whether the bag of dried beans would last another meal, whether your neighbor's odd glance yesterday was just indigestion or a prelude to an accusation. Then your thoughts would drift to God, to death, to whether anyone would remember you if you died tonight. And if they did, would they write it down? Or would it just become another confused legend? She used to stare at the stars, definitely suspicious. At night, medieval people weren't just victims of the dark. They were witnesses to the silence. Not a peaceful, spa-like silence, but the kind that makes you think. Anything could fall apart at any moment. And somehow they lived with that. They lay there, eyes open, breathing soft, counting stars, whispering prayers that no one would hear. So you're surrounded by death. Again, the neighbor's cart is full of bodies. The baker stopped baking, and someone just sneezed into their porridge like it's a casual Tuesday brunch with Satan. You might ask, what is causing this nightmare? But no one asks that. Instead, they ask, whose fault is it? Because if there's one thing humanity excels at, especially in times of crisis, it's blaming anything with a pulse, a mole, or a suspiciously large collection of cats. Let's begin with the classic suspects, the witches. Obviously, they're women, independent, often herbalists, clearly demonic. Never mind that they're the only people who know how to make tea that doesn't kill you. They're unmarried, they whisper to plants, and sometimes, brace yourself, they live alone. That's 3 strikes, straight to the firewood pile. Then there's the Jews, tragically, the go-to scapegoat of medieval Europe. The water's poisoned, cries the crowd, the wells, and somehow, despite also dying from the plague, the Jews are accused of orchestrating the whole thing with a secret rat army and elite flea militia. Why? Because they're different. They write weird. They don't eat pork. And most importantly, they didn't die first. That was enough. Some towns went full conspiracy theory. Entire communities were wiped out not by disease, but by fear, ignorance, and very organized mobs. Because what better way to fight a plague than by killing people who aren't even sick? Next up, the planets. Yes, the stars. Medieval astrologers had a field day. Jupiter and Saturn aligned in 1345. they said, stroking their beards. And that clearly caused an airborne, blood-spitting pandemic. Makes perfect sense. Just like blaming Mercury retrograde for your career choices. Then came the wells, the cats, the sin of vanity, bathing too often, not bathing at all, and the rise of women reading things. All equally plausible to a society whose version of science was rubbing onions on your feet and waiting for divine feedback. But perhaps the most creatively medieval solution was music. Yes, people danced in the streets for days until they collapsed. Some believed this would appease the heavens, others just really hated silence. And while all this happened as people blamed, burned, banished, and boogied, the plague continued its merry little tour, unbothered, unrushed, unimpressed. You'd think at some point they'd say, maybe it's the rats. But no, the rats were cute, they were small, they looked like sad medieval puppies. Plus, they didn't talk back. Much easier to blame the widow on the edge of town who collects lavender and occasionally laughs alone. And that, dear listener, is the true medieval art form, misdirection. Because when everything's on fire, and your neighbor has boils the size of plums, and your priest is giving last rites in batches, the only comfort left is a good, solid finger to point. When aristocrats invented remote work by moving to the countryside, permanently. By now, we've bathed in herbs, sniffed suspicious perfumes, survived a night where dreams could literally get us burned at the stake, and maybe, just maybe, seen one less flea in the bedding. But as fear of contagion crept closer, and prayers began to sound more like frantic Yelp reviews for salvation, the upper class of medieval society decided it was time for a drastic measure: disappear. And no, not disappear into a meditation retreat or detox spa. We're talking about full-blown medieval social distancing, 14th century style. The noble solution: flee. Not from war, not from taxes, but from people. Which honestly might be the most relatable part of this entire era. Wealthy families packed up their trunks, mostly filled with wine, religious texts, and velvet hats, and left their bustling, plague-ridden cities behind. Their destination: isolated country estates, preferably ones with extra land, fewer peasants, and, ideally, walls tall enough to forget the outside world ever existed. Think of it as the original gated community, but with more moats and less plumbing. And make no mistake, this wasn't a temporary escape. It was a full-on withdrawal from society. They brought their cooks, their butlers, their personal confessors, and sometimes even their favorite jester. Because what's the point of surviving if no one is making dark plague jokes over dinner? And within these countryside mansions, new rules of life emerged. First rule: no outsiders. Second rule: seriously, no outsiders. Third rule: if you're from the city or, God forbid, show symptoms of a cough, you're not just turned away. You're the subject of a new bedtime ghost story. Social distancing was not just medical precaution, it was spiritual insurance. The thinking was, if they stayed clean morally and physically, and far from the common folk, perhaps God would spare them. And if not, at least they'd die somewhere scenic, with better lighting for portrait painting. Meanwhile, back in the city, the poor had no such luxury. They stayed behind, praying in overpacked churches and waiting for miracles that were usually delayed, if not canceled outright. But in the countryside, the elite rewrote the meaning of isolation. They dined separately. They washed more. They even made sure their bread was baked by someone who hadn't sneezed since last spring. Of course, rumors swirled that all this hiding was cowardly, that the nobility had abandoned their people. But the truth, it wasn't cowardice, it was early adoption. The medieval elite were basically beta testing the first version of WFH, worship from home. And in doing so, they accidentally invented something timeless. The belief that with enough property, distance, and denial, no problem is too big to avoid. But while some locked themselves away in stone fortresses, others ventured out with torches and chants, convinced that the plague wasn't a disease at all, but a punishment. So next, we follow the trail of those who chose to purify the world not by hiding, but by bleeding. Why self-punishment became a road trip and accidentally spread the plague. While the wealthy were busy retreating to their countryside villas, practicing early versions of aristocratic quarantine with silverware and psalms, a very different reaction to the plague was unfolding down in the dustier, holier parts of Europe. Mass repentance by way of self-inflicted beatings. Enter the flagellants. No, it's not a heavy metal band, though honestly it should be. These were groups of deeply religious men and occasionally women who believed that the plague wasn't just an unfortunate coincidence involving rats and filth. Oh no, this was divine wrath. And if God was angry, then humanity needed to be punished. So they volunteered. Their method: walk from town to town in long, slow, chanting processions while whipping themselves, not metaphorically, literally. They carried leather cords, often embedded with metal studs or barbs, and used them to lash their backs raw in public squares. Blood was the price of forgiveness, and also, apparently, the medieval version of event entertainment. Everywhere they went, they drew crowds. Not because people wanted to join, though some did, either out of genuine devotion or intense FOMO, but because it was hard to look away from 30 people, rhythmically punishing themselves to organ music. Flagellants weren't monks. They weren't official clergy. In fact, the church got nervous about them pretty quickly. After all, you can't have laypeople walking around proclaiming divine messages, organizing their own rituals, and bleeding all over the place without asking for papal permission first. And the flagellants didn't just whip themselves. They gave sermons, unofficial ones, usually a little fiery, usually delivered with a back still dripping, and shouted about the sins of the world. Greed, lust, vanity, urban architecture. You name it. They believed the only way to stop the plague was for everyone collectively to suffer. If you weren't crying and bruised by sundown, were you even trying? Here's the irony. The very act that was supposed to purify the land helped spread the plague. The flagellants traveled in large groups, slept in barns, touched everything, and refused to be still. No masks, no distancing, just spiritual cardio and an enthusiastic lack of germ theory. And while some towns welcomed them as saviors, others locked their gates in fear. You never quite knew if they were going to bring divine healing or just another wave of coughing. Eventually, even the church had to step in. The Pope issued official decrees banning the flagellant processions. But by then, the damage, emotional, physical, and epidemiological, had been done. Still, their legacy lingers. Because when faced with chaos, humans will do almost anything to feel like they're helping, even if it means hitting yourself in the spine with a chain in front of your neighbors. And if you think that's the darkest it gets, just wait. Because next we enter the real theater of horror, the medieval bedroom, or more accurately, the medieval latrine. Let's talk toilets, or the terrifying lack thereof. A tale of mystery holes, strategic buckets, and dignity left behind. So, you've survived the procession of the flagellants, resisted the temptation to join a traveling self-flagellation troupe, and you're now back in your quaint medieval home. You've had your modest supper, maybe some slightly moldy bread with a side of existential dread, and now it hits you. The question no medieval person ever asked out loud, but everyone desperately needed to solve. Where do I go? There were no signs, no plumbing, no jingles from auto-flushing Japanese toilets, just instinct and hope. In medieval terms, the word bathroom was more suggestion than destination. In castles, the high-end model was a wooden bench with a hole, positioned over a chute that dropped directly into the moat. A moat which, fun fact, now doubled as a shared ecosystem for frogs, sewage, and disease. The real royal treatment. For the average person, it was even more artisanal. Maybe a bucket, maybe a pit, maybe a walk to a spot behind the barn where no one looked twice unless they stepped in it. There were no standard procedures, only survival tactics. The concept of waste management was just beginning to crawl out of the primordial ooze, and it showed. There was no sewage system. The closest thing to running water was last week's rain still pooled on your roof. Flushing was not a word, it was a fantasy. Things didn't go away, they fermented. And the smell, oh dear listener. If you've ever walked into a questionable gas station, restroom, and thought, this is bad, imagine that. But inside your home, with no ventilation, and someone just finished eating aged goat cheese, multiply that by 400 years. That's your baseline. But wait, it gets worse. Because some folks believed human waste could be reused. Economically, they collected it, dried it, and used it as fertilizer. This included not only horse and cow manure, but the full medieval buffet of excrement. And if you happen to slip into the communal dung pile, well, good luck. And please don't touch anything. Nobles had close stools, a kind of pre-toilet toilet that involved sitting on a padded wooden chair with a chamber pot hidden inside. They would do their business while reading, praying, or discussing politics. Because nothing quite says refined culture like metaphysics and bowel movements happening simultaneously. Nighttime posed another set of problems. Going outside after dark was a risk. What with the uneven roads, roaming pigs, potential ghosts, and the sheer lack of lighting? The solution: a chamber pot under the bed, perfectly discreet, also perfectly kickable with your bare foot at 2 a.m. And yes, some people, let's not name names, used urine for laundry. Why? Because they thought it had disinfectant properties. Does it? No. Was it common? Tragically, yes. And if you're wondering how people smell, the answer is, like confusion and ammonia. Yet somehow, through this grand absence of indoor plumbing, people still managed to live, to love, to throw parties, to wear 10 layers of wool and act fancy. They were covered in filth, but covered with confidence. It's almost poetic. A civilization built on chamber pots, perfumed gloves, and denial. And now that you know how they managed their most private business, you may be tempted to light a scented candle in gratitude. But hold on to that match, because next we're entering the sacred art of medieval bathing, an event so rare, so ceremonious, and so suspicious. It required community participation and moral clearance. Because who needs privacy when you're already emotionally naked? If you think of taking a bath as a quiet, relaxing experience, steam rising, lavender-scented bubbles, a lo-fi playlist humming softly in the background, congratulations. You're not in the 14th century. In medieval times, bathing wasn't a routine. It was a plan, a production, a test of courage. First, you had to find water, clean water ideally. That meant hauling it up from a well, dodging floating breadcrumbs in the river, or praying to all known saints that the rain barrel out back hadn't been claimed by birds. Assuming you struck liquid gold, the next step was heating it. There were no taps, no thermostats, just a cauldron over an open flame, and a vague hope you wouldn't accidentally scald yourself into sainthood. Bucket by bucket, you'd fill a wooden tub until it resembled something between soup and baptism. And you didn't bathe alone. Oh no, that would be luxurious. Instead, you bathed with your family, your neighbors, sometimes a goat if it slipped in. Water was precious, and once it was heated, you milked it for all it was worth. First in. Best experience. Last in. Congratulations, you are now soaking in a memory of everyone who came before. As for soap, rare. If you were lucky, you might get a chunk of animal fat and lime miracle. A bar that smelled like disappointment and old stew. Shampoo didn't exist. People washed their hair with ash, or, if they were feeling experimental, vinegar and prayers. For scrubbing, they used their hands. For drying, yesterday's shirt. And then there was the issue of public bathhouses. Because nothing says intimacy like 50 damp strangers in a steamy wooden hut. These were the original wellness retreats, except instead of massage tables, there were heated benches and rumors. You didn't just clean yourself there, you socialized, you flirted, you gossiped. In some towns, bathhouses doubled as matchmaking venues and sometimes unofficial brothels. This did not sit well with the church. Too many naked bodies. Too much steam, not enough shame. Soon, the clergy declared these houses morally suspicious. Suddenly, scrubbing your back became an act of rebellion. Cleanliness started to smell like sin, and so began the age of dry bathing. A cultural reset. People started to clean themselves by wiping down with herbs, scrubbing their skin with cloths, and relying on perfume to do the heavy lifting. If you hadn't touched water in 3 moons, that was fine. You were virtuous now, holy, not unhygienic, just blessed with a strong personal scent. The funny part, They still wanted to be clean, they still longed for it. They boiled water, they stirred in herbs. They kept trying, even when the world told them to stop. Because beneath all the superstitions and the soot, humans still wanted to feel, just for a moment, like the dirt wasn't permanent. So if you're sitting in a bubble bath tonight, basking in your fifth layer of self-care, take a second to thank your ancestors. They walked so you could soak. Now we've washed away the guilt, but we still haven't addressed the stink. In the next part, we'll climb the social ladder, where perfume wasn't a luxury. It was a divine signal that you hadn't died yet. In today's world, perfume is about attraction, about covering up the smell of instant noodles on your hoodie. But in medieval times, smelling good was a statement. It was how you told the world, I am not dead yet. Let's be clear. If you smelled nice in the Middle Ages, it wasn't because you bathed. It was because you could afford not to. Perfume was not for people who used soap. It was for people who didn't need to, because they had other, stronger smelling tools at their disposal. A dab behind the ear, a splash on the sleeve, not to seduce, but to survive the stench of 20 unwashed bodies in a sealed room with one tiny window and zero ventilation. Perfume wasn't an accessory. It was armor. And no, this perfume didn't come from a boutique in Paris. It came from cauldrons, goat fat, crushed herbs, and the kind of ingredients that would make a modern chemist cry. Think, musk extracted from deer glands, ambergris from whale intestines, rose oil if you were lucky, burnt myrrh and powdered root if you were. This wasn't fragrance. This was fortitude in liquid form. People believed smell could ward off disease. Bad smells were where evil lived, where sickness hid. So naturally, the logic followed. If you reeked like a bouquet set on fire, you were protecting yourself. You weren't gross. You were safe. And the rich, they went all in. Scented gloves, scented hats, scented paper. Some nobles even wore necklaces containing soaked cotton balls dripping with essential oils, medieval diffuser jewelry. One duchess reportedly wouldn't leave her house unless she had been marinated in at least 5 different scents. Because if death came knocking, she planned to answer the door fabulously. But smell wasn't just about hygiene or protection. It became moral. The cleaner you smelled, the holier you were assumed to be. A body that stank must have something wrong inside. And so, a good scent became a sign of virtue, a cloud of righteousness that clung to you, sometimes more stubbornly than the dirt underneath. There was no body positivity movement, no natural musk appreciation. You either smelled divine or you were suspect. In fact, if someone caught a whiff of you and couldn't place the scent as floral, woodsy, or vaguely holy, you might be accused of witchcraft, or worse, of being common. Funny, isn't it? The most invisible part of a person, their smell, became the most visible sign of goodness, a sort of airborne morality test, as if your soul passed through your skin and announced itself every time you entered a room. And if you think this idea died with the Black Plague, ask yourself this: why did you choose that clean linen body spray over the one that smells like warm milk and shame? Maybe somewhere inside we still believe that how we smell says something about who we are. So, we've washed, we've perfumed, we've dressed to survive, But none of that matters if you can't make it through the night. By now, you've scented yourself like a mythological salad bar. You've survived plagues with perfume, cloaked your fear in velvet, and learned to pretend nighttime doesn't exist. But what if sleep itself betrayed you? In medieval Europe, dreams were dangerous territory. Not the I showed up to class naked kind of dream. We're talking heresy-inducing, soul-condemning, trial-by-fire dreams. Literally. You see, when bathing was a sin and perfume was a virtue, sleep became suspicious. Especially the kind that involved dreaming. Because what was a dream, really, if not a secret chat with spirits, with demons, with yourself? And that, dear sleeper, was unacceptable. Dream of flying. That's not freedom, it's witchcraft in training. Dream of talking to animals. Either you need a friend or you're a dark sorcerer in beta mode. Dream of smiling. Now that's a problem. Joy in your sleep was considered a sign of spiritual sloppiness. A lazy soul. And a lazy soul was practically begging for divine punishment. Clergy and inquisitors alike believed the truly faithful didn't dream. Or if they did, it was just grainy reruns of saints doing holy things in muted tones. Anything outside that was flirting with the devil's playlist. A nightmare wasn't your subconscious processing stress. It was proof that something was festering inside you. A dark pact. A demonic flirtation. Maybe you didn't mean to sign up, but tough luck. You drooled during confession and now it's official. And if you ever had the misfortune of dreaming something other people found unsettling, oh boy, that was enough. You didn't even need to have the dream. Someone else could dream about you and bam, you're on trial. Imagine sipping watered-down soup when someone bursts in and says, "Last night, I dreamt you turned into a goat and flew away." You, blinking over your bowl, are now a suspect in metaphysical livestock transmutation. There were even professional dream interpreters who could explain your dream in one of two ways. Option A, you're destined for sainthood. Start fasting. Option B, you're possessed. Start running. You can guess which outcome was more common for peasants and women. And so, people learned the art of not dreaming, or at least not admitting they dreamed. They trained themselves to lie flat, breathe slow, and never talk in their sleep. If you did snore, you'd better pray it sounded like Latin. Sleep became a covert operation. You weren't resting. You were surviving, and in the morning you'd wake up, pretend everything was fine, and carry on with your routine. A bit of stale bread, a splash of holy water, and a silent hope that your pillow didn't leak secrets in the night. So what did medieval folks do when they couldn't sleep at all? When the terror of dreaming was worse than the exhaustion? That's what part 9 is for. When staring at the stars was safer than closing your eyes. And insomnia wasn't a medical condition. It was a survival skill. And so, after a sleepless night filled with flickering candlelight and wind howling through thatched roofs, medieval folks returned to the only thing left they could truly rely on. Exhaustion, not faith, not bread, just that bone-deep weariness that finally put them out. Sleep at this point wasn't something they hoped for. It was surrender, a kind of whatever happens, happens. They curled up in blankets that smelled like fermented bird nests, folded their arms over empty stomachs, and let their eyes finally give up. No one played meditation music for them, but there was still a lullaby of sorts, the patter of rat feet overhead, the rhythmic breathing of the person next to them, and sometimes the gentle smacking of someone dreaming and still chewing. The night was silent, not because everything was okay, but because everyone was too tired to worry anymore. And in that exhaustion, there was something like forgiveness. Forgiveness for the creaky bed. Forgiveness for the scratchy wool blanket. Forgiveness even for the neighbor groaning for 2 hours straight from either a toothache or heartache. Hard to say. When the whole village finally drifted off, no one checked what you dreamed about. No one made you confess for smiling in your sleep. And no one recorded your dreams of glowing meadows, places with no plague, no odor, and definitely no lice. That's the beautiful part of night. It forgives. It gives you a brief moment to stop being scared, to stop pretending, to stop answering anyone's questions about morality, hygiene, or why you smell like incense mixed with expired cheese. It just lets you rest. And in that rest, whether deep or restless, real or faked, there's a kind of tiny peace. As if the darkness itself leans in and whispers, "It's okay. Tomorrow starts again." With vinegar, lice, and clothing heavier than your emotional baggage, but still tomorrow. So if you're listening to this now, in the soft glow of a modern nightlight, in a room quiet enough to hear your own breath, know this. You've made it further than they ever could. You've got memory foam. You've got toothpaste. You've got dreams that don't need approval from a priest. And if tonight you still can't sleep, that's okay too. Maybe you're doing exactly what your medieval ancestors did for centuries, staring into the dark, exhaling, and whispering something profoundly human. Just make it to morning.